in terms of the impact of the crisis, is primarily felt in Asia.
About 80% of oil and 90% of LNG passing through the strait goes to Asia.
There's so many different factors that determine how a country is exposed. Availability of storage, availability of alternative resources.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Asia Society Policy Institute webinar on After the Shock, Rethinking Energy Security in Asia. I'm Farwa Amir and I'm the Director of South Asia Initiatives here at ASPE in New York. For years, energy security in Asia has been discussed as a long-term challenge, one tied to economic growth, the energy transition, and rising demand. But recent events have turned it into an immediate strategic concern. The disruptions triggered by the ongoing US-Israel-Iran conflict have once again demonstrated how quickly geopolitical tensions can reverberate across global markets. What may begin as a crisis in one region can rapidly affect fuel prices, commodity supplies, shipping routes, and economic stability across the globe. For Asia, especially South Asia and Southeast Asia, where many economies remain heavily dependent on imported energy, those vulnerabilities have become impossible to ignore. The consequences extend far beyond oil markets. Rising energy costs are placing pressure on government budgets, forex reserves, and household finances, while disruptions to critical inputs such as fertilizers are raising broader concerns about food security and economic resilience. Across South Asia and Southeast Asia, policymakers are confronting difficult questions about how to manage immediate risks while preparing for a more uncertain geopolitical landscape. At the same time, the region's energy needs continue to grow. Industrial expansion, urbanization, and the rapid development of digital infrastructure are driving demand upward, even as governments seek to diversify supply sources, accelerate clean energy deployment, and strengthen resilience against future shocks. This makes this midpoint of 2026 a particularly important moment for reflection. As global leaders prepare for major diplomatic and climate gatherings later this year, there is an opportunity to reassess some fundamental assumptions about energy security in Asia. What does resilience look like in an era of persistent geopolitical volatility? How can regional cooperation be strengthened? What role will China and the United States play in shaping the region's energy future? And how can countries balance immediate energy needs with longer-term energy transition goals? These are the kind of questions we hope to explore today. And to help us do so, I'm delighted to be joined by an outstanding panel of experts. Thank you all for joining me today. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping notes. I'll start with questions from my end for the panel, and at about the 50-minute mark, we'll take questions via the Zoom Q&A box in front of you. So please send in your queries, and we'll try to get to as many as possible as we can in this session today. So without further ado, let me just start with a question to all of you. As we all understand, we are witnessing one of the most significant disruptions to global energy markets and commodity supply chains in recent history. So from your vantage point, how do you assess the immediate and longer-term vulnerabilities facing Asia and its subregions, given the lack of a clear resolution between the conflicting parties and growing concerns over the future of the Strait of Hormuz? And as governments across Asia respond to these pressures, and they've been responding over the past 3 months, addressing the energy crisis and battling these food security concerns, what stands out to all of you in terms of regional policy preparedness? So if I could start with Atul, you, and then Kate, and then Sam. Over to you.
Thank you, Farwa. It's great to be on this webinar with Kate and Sam. So I will first frame the challenge and then sort of the options, as you say, or what is happening on the resilience front. So just to kind of frame the challenge, about 15 million barrels based on our analysis at S&P Global, 15 million barrels per day of crude oil and products is not coming into the market because of the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. And most of that has been going into Asian markets. So the Asia is most significantly impacted. Similarly, about 17% of LNG is not coming into the market, and that's also mostly going into the Asian economies. So in terms of the impact of the crisis, it's primarily felt in Asia. Just one other data point for our audience. In the last big crisis of similar magnitude in the 1970s, about 8% of global supply was stopped after the Arab embargo. This time around is 16%, and it's 16% of a much larger volume. And most of that, again, as I said, going into Asia. So this is a massive energy shock, and actually at present energy crisis into the Asian markets. So in terms of responsiveness and preparedness, I think the example I would give is one of Japan. It's the most prepared of any country. Actually, I would say it's most prepared of pretty much any country in the world, and for good reasons, because the majority of its energy comes from imported energy. It has close to, based on their own analysis, 9 months of oil supply, crude oil, which they can refine in their own refineries. Japan gets only 6% of its LNG from the Middle East, so it has a highly diversified. It's a big consumer of LNG, but only 6% coming from Asia and from the Middle East. And also overall, it is highly energy efficient. It has the infrastructure to tackle a crisis of this size. I think there are other countries have very, very low preparedness, and we can come back and talk about what they need to do. But building storage, building stocks is a key part of that resilience, and of course, building diversified energy supplies is a key part of again the resilience. So far, very big impact on Asia. Not very many countries are well prepared. I mean, one of the things I should just add is they're also doing rationing in some ways, like people working from home in India. Request from the prime minister said, don't travel overseas, work from home. In some places, there is rationing, like you can buy only 50 liters of petrol. I think that's in Indonesia. So many different things, but no silver bullet to come out of this crisis.
And thank you, Atul. Kate.
Thanks, Farwa. I'd start by saying I think one can really liken this to sort of a Ukraine moment for Asia. So as Atul pointed out, Asia is particularly exposed to the Strait of Hormuz, and put another way, about 80% of oil and 90% of LNG passing through the strait goes to Asia. And there are a couple different factors that matter when you look at the preparedness of the region. So obviously, the degree of dependence, as was just mentioned, the amount of strategic reserves, diversification of supply, which can mean both from other countries in terms of fossil fuels, but also diversification to clean and renewable energy, as well as the flexibility of domestic energy systems. So as Atul pointed out, one of the big responses that we've seen given the supply dependencies has been this idea of demand destruction. So you see policies from governments that are asking citizens to not travel to work to reduce the amount of oil and gas that's needed, and other means that could potentially be locked in depending on what happens and how things play out. But then you also see some economies that have diversified their fuel sources being a bit better prepared. And I think an interesting example of this is Pakistan, which imported a huge amount of solar in recent years and could potentially save over $6 billion on oil and gas imports as a result of that. And that's a really interesting story that we can unpack, coming from the extreme drop in the price of solar, but also high prices for other energy sources in Pakistan coming from the grid, including as a result of coal. In terms of preparedness, I would actually point to China as being particularly prepared. So China gets about a third of its oil imports and a quarter of its seaborne gas from Hormuz. But in the near term, it has been relatively prepared for a couple of reasons. One is the stockpiling efforts. There's a bit of a lack of transparency around how much strategic reserves China actually has and how much it's been tapping them. But in addition to that, China also has very limited use of gas in its power sector, somewhere around 3 to 4%. So it's not a huge issue. And then at the same time, the huge penetration of electric vehicles has reduced reliance on oil and gas overall. What I would point to in terms of risks going forward is if the crisis continues, how that will impact economic sustainability in the region. Right now, part of the reason China is okay is because it's also been able to continue exporting goods to other countries. But if those other countries stop purchasing those exports, that will have a huge impact on the Chinese economy that will then reverberate in other ways. And then also at the same time, China's focused on self-sufficiency, but in some ways at the expense of the region. So putting limitations on exports of refined fuels and fertilizers and things like that that could have ripple effects across the region as well.
Thank you very much, Kate. Sam, would you?
Yeah, I would echo what both of the other speakers have said so far. Measuring exposure to the conflict is actually much easier said than done. There's so many different factors that determine how a country is exposed, and share of imports from the Middle East, from the Gulf, um, availability of storage, availability of alternative resources. Japan, the Philippines, and Pakistan all procure about 90% of their crude oil from the.
Sam, and we've lost your audio. As we wait for Sam to connect his audio back, I think a couple of very important things that both you, Kate, and Atul highlighted, and would love to come back to more, is of course China's role in this energy future in Asia, but of course its own future when it comes to renewable energy transition. But the solar boom thing is very important to also acknowledge. But at the same time, when you look at a country like Pakistan, it is a certain class of the society that's able to adopt more than the others. So what does that transition mean when you look at the entirety of the population? Sam, do we have your audio back?
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh,
Back
great.
to
I'll
you.
just finish my thought, and I apologize for that. But, oftentimes when we measure crude oil storage, we're talking weeks in places like Japan and China and South Korea. But when we look at LNG storage, it's much more difficult. Countries around the region really lack the kind of large scale storage infrastructure that might be necessary to reduce exposure to this conflict. And in emerging markets like in Southeast Asia, we're talking just a matter of days. And I think the main point here is that all countries are going to be indirectly exposed to the price shocks. Even diversified economies like Japan will see electricity prices and fuel prices escalate as a result of the conflict. And I don't think these prices are going to come back down anytime soon. Many people expecting LNG prices to remain high into 2027, as well as potential increases in oil prices as well. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you all for setting this context really well and talking about the structural vulnerabilities that are defining Asia, including economies that are a little bit more diversified than the others. And given the constraints that we've seen in the LNG and LPG supplies and will continue to see all the way into 2027, one of the most striking aspects of this crisis is that it comes just as many Asian economies were already trying to accelerate decarbonization. Yet with the intensifying energy security concerns that we've seen and we just talked about, we're also seeing countries re-emphasize coal as a more accessible solution to meet the demands, given all of the other constraints. How do you interpret this return to coal in major economies in South Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as broader Asia? And what could this return mean for renewable energy momentum and country emissions targets? So, Atul, if I can come back to you, and then Kate and Sam in that order.
Thank you, Farwa. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Coal is a key part of the power generation mix, as Sam was saying, in China and also in India also. Gas is not a big feedstock into power. So coal is very important. And it's important is, goes up and down, and it's going up a little bit because gas and LNG are not available. But at the same time, renewables are very cost competitive in most countries. And I would say that the journey the renewables are on is not going to be stopped. I mean, there are some geopolitical concerns, for example, the dominance of China in terms of the supply chains. But more broadly, if you look at what is happening on the renewables, particularly solar deployment in India and other parts of, Pakistan example earlier, it's that train is moving, and it's probably going to move fast. So I think it's not slowing down. Some countries are going to double down if they can to do even more renewables. I think coal has two kind of places. One is, of course, continuing as part of the current mix. But other thing which is happening, not quite related to the crisis, is the climate impact. And we are seeing very high temperatures even now, which is not that late into summer. in places like India, and therefore you need base load power or peaking power, and that is coming from a lot of that is coming from coal, because that's the easiest thing to ramp up to during the base load, during the peaking times. I'm sorry. So I think we're going to see coal, but I won't call this as a seminal shift back to coal. I think it's a temporary shift. I think the one other important thing, last thing I'll say, is that what is we are seeing is the thinking that energy security has a new definition, and that definitions mean that local energy, locally sourced energy, is the most secure energy. So that includes, of course, coal in many parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, China, but also renewables are local, right? And they have no price because they have no cost risk once they are installed. So I think we're going to have this different mindset about energy security, and in that kind of a frame, I think what happens with gas, particularly for power, it may lose share, whereas gas remains hugely important for other uses, whether it's domestic use and also for fertilizers, feedstock into fertilizers. So those uses are just not replaceable, but we can replace gas by other sources for power.
Thank you, Atul. Kate, over to you. Do you also see this as a short-term pivot?
I very much agree with Atul in the sense that this is most likely just a temporary trend and not a long-term one. So I think just to start, it's important to draw a distinction between coal investment and actual coal use. And overall, just from a macro perspective, we're seeing more coal power being built, but at the same time, less coal actually being used. Zooming into the region, there's also sort of two different policy responses on coal in the context of the current crisis. One are those that basically lift caps on the use of coal and basically enable shifting from gas use in the power sector back to coal. I think those, are where we're seeing more of the short-term increase in more coal usage. And then there's delays of phasing out coal power, which, we see in Japan, Thailand, Philippines, which give a little bit more leeway, but it doesn't necessarily mean more coal is actually being used. And like Atul said, renewables are very cost competitive. So even if countries might be investing more in terms of providing more capacity that they think will secure supply in the long term, they might not actually be using it. And I bring up this framing that China sometimes uses of xian li hou po, which basically means to build out the new energy system before dismantling the old one. And in terms of what this means in practice, that countries will be building out renewable energy systems that supply that energy security at the same time that they might also keep the coal power online. So I think it's really important to pay attention to what the actual emissions trends are in real time rather than targets, and keeping an eye on the real economy. The last thing I'd say is where I do think there may be a considerable risk is on investment in coal to synthetic fuels, especially in China. So this is basically transforming coal into fuels that replace oil and gas, but based from coal. And from an energy security perspective, the reason why China and other countries like India are now investing in this area is for energy security reasons, because these fuels can replace imported fuels. And they're highly polluting in terms of the production process. So I would certainly keep an eye on that area as something that might seem like an energy security play, but could pose a risk from other perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate. Sam, over to you.
My answer is similar again. It's the difficulty with this question is separating trends that were already happening pre-Iran crisis from after the Iran crisis. And I don't want to sound flippant when I say that I have not in Southeast Asia seen a real meaningful shift back to coal. You see high-level announcements from governments saying they're going to do whatever they can to mitigate the energy shock. If that means coal, they may bring some back online, but the actual mechanisms for doing so remain really kind of vague. So the Philippines announced an emergency order in which it said it was going to use more coal and less LNG. But in a privatized system like the Philippines, it's unclear how that actually happens. In Vietnam, coal generation was up 1% year over year in March. I think some of the most tangible announcements we've seen have been from Thailand, which is restarting 2 coal units. But really, I think the major hit here is for LNG when it comes to power generation. LNG was already struggling to compete economically with coal and renewables. And I think we could see an acceleration of this leapfrogging mindset directly to a consumer-led build-out of renewable energy in the region. Yeah.
And thank you, Sam. So the consensus is that there might be investment, but it might just not be in terms of operational means as we go forward. There will be more on the renewable side, and that's going to build the energy security futures for many of these countries. But we've talked a lot about India, Pakistan, but also in terms of fuel rationing and austerity measures that were announced in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka as well. So let's turn to South Asia, Atul, where industrial expansion, digital infrastructure, AI investment, and population growth, they're all driving rapidly rising energy demands across these economies. So when you look at a region like South Asia, how should governments balance these long-term growth ambitions with the realities of external energy dependence that we've discussed? Along with supply chain vulnerabilities and the market volatility. So, what does energy security need to look like? You've given us this new definition, but what does it need to look like for the next phase of South Asia's economic growth? So, what do you, Atul?
Yeah, so I hope our audience knows very well what Winston Churchill said over 100 years back, that the security of energy lies in variety and variety alone, which we can say diversity is another word for variety. And I think I would offer 4 pillars for the countries to consider. It's nothing really new. First thing is countries need to accelerate the development of energy sources they already have domestically in pretty much every country, and we've all talked about it already. Renewables are there everywhere, right? Now, the degree of how much solar you can do in a country like Malaysia is different than what you can do in India, so that of course varies. But you can do a lot of power, renewable power, let's say. So that's one thing. Second thing is they can diversify into more secure logistics, right? So as both Kate and Sam said, you could have oil and gas supplies, which you're dependent on mostly from more than just one source, more than just the Middle East. And Japan is a good example of the diversification. My feeling is that we will see more of that, and that diversification will include supplies from Africa. There is supplies in Southeast Asia and then also in South America. And with the modern VLCCs, very large crude carriers and other large ships, the costs are not that high. I mean, the one other thing I should have said at the beginning is energy security is going to require a premium. I mean, it's not going to come for free. So people will have to, the consumers ultimately, or governments, if they want to, have to bear the cost of it. So diversification will add some cost, not always very high, but that will be a second thing. Third thing I'll quickly say is, we already talked about the issue of stocks. Countries have good oil stocks, and of course oil stock, and Kate mentioned China. But as Sam pointed out, LNG or gas is not something people are storing. Most of the LNG storage is in their regas facilities, which is not really a storage. And then there are other things: LPG, naphtha, fertilizer, helium, sulfur. I mean, there are a lot of other things where countries can build stock. And the last thing I will say, which we haven't talked much about, on the transport side, we have to develop other alternative resources. So, for example, biofuels, which has been a big kind of, always lurking in the back but never gaining scale, now could be an opportunity for a large country like India with huge waste to do more biofuels. I think electrification of transportation, particularly light-duty vehicle, is another low-hanging fruit. And in most of these countries we're talking for, there are a lot of two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So I think one of the lowest hanging opportunities is to convert as many of those two and three-wheelers into electric two and three-wheelers. That itself will reduce the dependence on imported oil. So some ideas to address your question.
Thank you, Atul. And that is an excellent point, given the population and the kind of need and demand there is for transport and logistics, that is something that governments should be looking at. And then we go back to something that we discussed earlier, and that is, developing stocks and petroleum reserves. They don't have enough. India is now investing. There's a partnership with the UAE during Prime Minister Modi's recent visit, where there's commitment from the UAE to be investing in India's petroleum reserves. Pakistan is also in conversation to build stockpiles for future, and then also, critical minerals, is a key part of these partnerships that we're seeing, especially between these middle powers, but also between the United States and other countries, and which are core components of clean energy tech. So there are things that their governments are doing in terms of policy responses, in terms of partnerships to secure energy futures and economic futures. It's just that how will they work in a timely fashion to be able to cushion the blow as the volatility remains around what's coming next. And this is not the first geopolitical crisis that has had shockwaves sent through Asia, and it's not going to be the last. But Sam, over to you. If I could bring that same question to you and put a Southeast Asia lens to it, how should governments think about their long-term industrial growth objectives? There are major economies there as well, major investments coming in AI infrastructure and otherwise. So with that external energy exposure and infrastructure constraints, what do you see for the industrial growth objectives there?
A few lessons stand out to me here. And the first big one is that energy security and macroeconomic stability have become the main drivers of the energy transition. After two successive shocks, these are some of the most important considerations now, far beyond, I think, climate considerations. We see, the persistent problem was always the energy trilemma, how to ensure security, affordability, and sustainability. And I think after these two crises, we start to see a convergence of those factors. Renewables are low-hanging fruit for providing energy security domestically. They're much more cost competitive than they were several years ago. Prices continue to fall for solar and for batteries, and we're seeing countries now set record solar panel imports around the region in just the past several months. And really, countries are using limited fiscal space have to use limited fiscal space for other key priorities. And a good tangible example here is a proposed 4.8 gigawatt LNG to power project in Vietnam was canceled by the developer, which now wants to build a portfolio of solar, wind, and batteries. And the company said that the draw on foreign exchange reserves would simply be too high to pay for the recurring cost of LNG imports for the facilities. By my estimates, that one facility alone would have taken 6% of the country's entire foreign exchange reserves to fund the LNG inputs on an annual basis. We've also seen LNG projects canceled in the Philippines as well. And I think a second lesson is really that this is the importance of a consumer-led energy transition, opening up the availability of rooftop and commercial solar is going to be key here. Kate mentioned the Pakistan example. Pakistan has imported I forget the number, over 30 gigawatts of solar panels from China in the last 3 years, built largely on residential and commercial rooftops. You also see plans in Thailand and Vietnam to unlock direct power purchase agreements between renewable energy producers and large industrial consumers. And similarly, the Philippines is opening up retail competition, allowing consumers to choose their power supplies. I think this is really going to be a key trend going forward. It takes a lot of pressure off of the government balance sheets when you have consumers able to do this themselves. And the last point I would make is just the how critical it is to unlock the price discovery of renewable energy generation through auctions. A lot of times what we've seen is stop and start momentum on the transition because renewable energy rates are being set by governments. And if prices get too high or governments decide they don't want to continue to lower the price, they'll simply halt the auctions. And we've seen contracts be renegotiated in Vietnam and Thailand as a result of this kind of stop and start mechanism, but setting a clear trajectory for auctions, opening up competition via, reducing restrictions on foreign ownership of renewable energy projects will be key going forward. So those are three key lessons that stand out to me.
Thank you, Sam. And there's another side to this, which is regional cooperation. We can talk about this a little bit later when we look at Southeast Asia and ASEAN as this unit where all these countries come together, and how can some of these lessons be shared into best practices and models that the region can pursue together and set some precedent for future energy security needs. But Kate, we've discussed China quite a bit as a source of solar exports to some of these economies, Pakistan predominantly. So there's a geopolitical dimension to all of this. Clearly, the current situation has reinforced how deeply Asia remains connected to Gulf stability. We've discussed the dependence on Chinese clean energy technologies as it continues to grow. Russian oil is back in action as well. And the United States is also positioning itself as a strategic energy partner. In fact, the Quad foreign ministers meet that happened as well last month. They also launched an Indo-Pacific Energy Security Initiative because there's an interest from the US side, but also from other Quad countries to talk more about energy in light of the current circumstances. But how do you see this crisis reshaping Asia's long-term energy partnerships? Is China going to come out of this with more influence in the region? Over to you, Kate.
Important question. And I think, just to answer it up top, I would say that China's clean tech dominance is certainly something that the region is taking advantage of. So I'll unpack a little bit what that means and whether that means dependence or security and independence in other ways. But I'd start just by saying in China domestically, I think it's really interesting to see the response from the top leadership to this crisis, because China obviously is a massive producer of coal, and they could have doubled down on that in their rhetorical response. But instead, what they've done is really leaned into new energy. And you saw both President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Qiang, make very high-level statements. Li Qiang went to Sichuan and emphasized new energy as energy security. So I think just that political response in itself is notable, and it'll be interesting to see if that's something that's brought more into China's diplomacy. In terms of China's partnerships in the region, I'd start just by looking maybe at the near term on the fossil fuel side, and just note that China is a huge refiner of oil and gas and exported the region as a result of that. So there has been an interesting situation where when China put export bans on refined fuels, that did cause challenges for some of the regional partners. So just noting, for instance, Australia struggling to get jet fuel did reach out to China and get that jet fuel refined capacity start flowing again. And China's made some exceptions to other economies in the region, such as Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, to export some of these refined fuels, despite that ban or those limitations in place on a very strategic basis. So this is certainly something that we're seeing, and I think it'll be interesting to see whether this leads to a bit more diversification on that front in the future. But the much, much more important story is really what's happening with China's clean technology exports and, what that will mean for the region going forward. So we've seen huge spikes in exports of solar, electric vehicles, batteries. This is something that I would argue, I'd ask the question, is this influence or is this energy security? Because when there's a lack of a fuel dependency relationship, if more renewable energy locally can boost the industries that you already have, many of which are things like, for instance, garment production, other industries that, basically you can replace the fuel source for those to ensure that you still have domestic economy. I would argue that the lack of a fuel dependency in itself is more secure rather than a long-term dependence, despite the fact that this obviously at the same time is helping to boost China's economic interests as well. So in terms of some of the stories we've seen on electric vehicles, I think, Australia marched 67% in jump on those figures. Philippines is a really interesting example in electric vehicles as well. Very little, protection on that front, and really has been able to take advantage on the solar front. Malaysia, huge spike. But it's really happening pretty much everywhere across the region. And, that Pakistan story that we keep referencing, previously, it was sort of pointed out as an anomaly and a special case, but really what I'd pay attention to are the bottom-up drivers of countries taking advantage of China's low-cost, widely available clean technology. And, especially another part of this, of course, is demand domestically in China has been softening a bit in some of these areas, which is further putting tailwinds behind the exports as a result of some of the policy changes in China domestically. So it's really coming from both sides, but could be something that helps to lock in that demand destruction for oil and gas that we were talking about earlier on this webinar.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate, for painting that so very well for us. And we mentioned this earlier, being in the midpoint of 2026, we're in June. As we look ahead, we have a couple of important convenings coming up. The UN General Assembly in September, COP31 later this year, and there are other global summits that keep happening, as we go. But what do you think is still not being addressed seriously enough at the intersection of climate, energy, and the global economy? And how can these forums be better used to strengthen regional cooperation within Asia, something Sam was referring to within the ASEAN as well, and international partnerships that improve resilience in face of future energy and economic shocks? So I would love to get all of your thoughts on it. Atul, if I may start with you, and then Sam, and then Kate.
So I think the one thing I will highlight, which needs much more focus now, given that climate change is here and it's impacting people a lot more, the poor people than the wealthy out in the West, is adaptation. The global forums talk about adaptation, but the sort of adaptation and resilience will require a much more focus. And the second thing, which is has been talked about forever, is financing. And although there have been a lot of good moves made on financing, but it's still an incomplete. You have grading a course, and a lot of financing need is in Asia, in many of the countries we are talking about. Some of it is going to be grant financing. Some will be loans. So that needs to be addressed. The cost of those financing remains, it's disproportionately higher for the developing countries than it is for the developed countries. So how do we bring that down? And we all know that World Bank has made quite a lot of effort to address that, but that requires much higher priority now than it did before. And then not just the cooperation, not just among the developing countries, but sort of developed and developing countries, which is where UN and General Assembly, the COP come into play. I think that cooperation it has its bumps going on right now, and that needs to be addressed to say, are we all coming together and focusing on the long term? And the last thing I'll mention is diversification of the global supply chain. For many countries, no matter where they stand, it's a big concern, not just the diversification for, say, EVs or solar panels, Kate, as you mentioned, but also critical minerals, which is a huge part of the energy transition. And they are, in some cases, even more concentrated than EVs and solar panels. So how do we diversify? How do we create? It's good for the global economy. It's not just kind of diversification because we want to be away from one country, but the economy will also benefit. There'll be more jobs. And, for example, Africa can do more what they call beneficiation, value added to their critical minerals rather than just exporting the ores and that's being processed in other parts of the world. So there's a lot of things which these two bodies, and there are a lot of other meetings happening in between, as you pointed out, forward. Lots of opportunities, in my view.
Thank you, Atul. Sam, over to you.
Yeah, I think two important trends at the global level. The first is that, we're clearly entering a new phase of multilateralism in which we're seeing more of an emphasis on smaller, more flexible groupings of countries that are focusing on specific issues like technology deployment, supply chain integration and common standards. And a good example of this was the Santa Marta conference held on transitioning away from fossil fuels, in which the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said that this is kind of reflective of the new geometry of multilateralism. And so an emphasis on regional cooperation will be key here. And the other thing is that really the call is moving from higher level targets toward actual implementation. And we need, beyond just these higher level targets, we need more of a focus on actual concrete deliverables. So at the last COP, the Brazilian presidency announced a global roadmap for transitioning away from fossil fuels. And now it's going to be incumbent on various countries to actually implement these roadmap plans. I think, one of the things I'm looking for is in ASEAN is an alignment of regional taxonomies, green finance standards that ensure that lower cost capital can flow across borders to an agreed upon set of green projects. So the alignment of taxonomies in ASEAN is going to be key. And announcements about the ASEAN power grid are also going to be very interesting to watch. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank in October announced an ASEAN power grid financing initiative. And we'll see what kind of momentum can get built on that, aligning regulatory standards, actually identifying bankable interconnection projects are going to, I think, be really important in upcoming global negotiations.
Thank you, Sam. Kate, over to you.
Sure. So I think, having spent quite a bit of time around the UNFCCC and climate diplomacy processes, there's increasingly a focus on this word implementation, but still a gap between what actually is brought into those spaces and what those spaces have in terms of potential for accelerating implementation. And what I'd point to from this perspective is whether those spaces could become for real economy deals and basically a means of putting forward project pipelines on things like renewable investments that help to scale up the energy transition and at the same time improve energy security. I think it was really notable earlier this year when the Iran crisis erupted. We saw Simon Steele, the president of the UNFCCC, more clearly making that link between climate and energy security in a way that is, not typical for the president of the UNFCCC. That's more of a climate diplomacy focused role, but really bringing it into the forefront in terms of making that linkage. And, I think if we can see at the COP more of these bilateral relationships or regional relationships coming into play by putting forward concrete pipelines that help to scale up projects at, and provide financing vehicles and initiatives like that focus not so much on just targets, but actual real economy progress that can be measured from a bottom-up perspective in terms of what's actually being deployed. I think that's something that I talked previously about exports, and that's obviously a really important part of the picture. But if you don't also have mechanisms to promote grid scale renewable projects and help countries that have a lack of financing vehicles domestically or from other sources or need access to concessional capital in different forms, without those additional resources, that'll be particularly difficult. And then, also the other thing I'd highlight is just more support from a capacity building policy perspective, because, as this transition moves forward, more countries will need support from a power sector reform perspective. So I think that needs to be part of these packages. But I'd really, focus on, like, when we say implementation, what do we mean by that? And can that be translated into real economy progress that's brought into these spaces rather than focusing so much on, some of the initial negotiations around, elements of the Paris Agreement that are really important, but have largely been agreed already.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you all. I think one thing that we've seen also is how like-minded or issue-based coalitions have formed in recent times. And that's just not limited to what we're seeing with this energy crisis, but largely, I think, the geopolitical uncertainty, whether it's around trade or building economic resilience, we've seen countries come together. But one thing, Atul, I would like to get your thoughts on, we have not discussed very much, is the civil nuclear energy cooperation between the United States and India as a part of India's energy security future. How are you seeing that partnership evolving, and knowing that we've also seen a new bilateral critical minerals agreement? India is also a part of. You spoke about critical minerals earlier. India's also joined Pact Silica. It was at the ministerial with the United States. How do you see that as an anchor in the relationship and primarily benefiting India's energy future?
I think the nuclear piece is hugely important. India was actually a pioneer in developing nuclear energy for peaceful use, for power, but then it kind of stalled and it hasn't grown. If we take the relative position of, say, India versus China, and this pact, because it'll bring in, and one of the big impacts is who manages the liability, who carries the liability in this agreement. I think that's going to bring more private investments in India. The public sector investment is important, but really to grow India's nuclear energy is going to require more private investment. So I see that coming more also, from the U.S. companies. The other thing to keep in mind is that nuclear, more broadly, is a very good fit for India's energy needs because you can get electricity at a fairly decent cost. It's highly scalable. So we do need the variable power. We need solar and wind, but we also need nuclear because it has the scale advantage for India. And this agreement is still kind of, I think companies are absorbing it as to what it means, but we will see more investments going to India. And also the other things you mentioned, the silicon and the critical minerals, all of those things are going to help. I mean, one of the things we should recognize that India now, after China's energy demand growth is more or less plateauing. India is the largest country with the highest, fastest growth in energy demand globally. So it's going to play a very important role in the coming decade. And it will have an impact on other countries because of its growth. It could take some resources away from others, or it could be part of the overall global solution. So in that overall big picture, also nuclear is very important.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Atul. There's a question, Sam, for you, and actually there are two, so I'm just going to try and combine them together. What kind of indicators should investors look at to assess a country's macroeconomic and political capacities to support energy transition? And then I think there's another to your point that you mentioned earlier about ADB. And what roles do you see IIB, the ADB, and other multilateral institutions playing in bridging the financing gap, particularly in developing Asian nations? And is there a case for a coordinated facility specifically designed for crisis accelerated transition financing? So over to you, Sam.
Yeah, I think I'll start with the second question. Under my analysis, even if you raise the cost of capital on renewable energy 1 to 2%, it still becomes cheaper on a levelized cost basis than, for example, LNG because of the commodity price spikes in global markets. And ASEAN region wide is still at a very, very low share of renewable energy penetration. And multiple studies from the IEA and others have shown that you can reach 10 to 20% with only limited grid upgrades to accommodate that renewables. The case of Pakistan shows clearly what can happen even in emerging markets for the blossoming of solar. Meanwhile, you have these multilateral institutions like the World Bank, like the ADB, still providing financing and loan guarantees for LNG projects. And when commodity prices spike like this, that money essentially goes up in flames. I think that those efforts, that financing needs to be coupled with limitations that restrict the build out of projects that would lead to the same crises down the line. There needs to be some limitation that accelerates renewable energy weaning off countries from global import dependence. And I think that's going to be key going forward. The second question is, shoot, Farwa, can you remind me of the second question? Oh,
macroeconomic indicators, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at sovereign credit ratings, you can look at public debt to GDP, you can look at foreign exchange reserves and months of import cover. A lot of times what agencies like the IMF look at is how much of your foreign exchange can cover your short-term debt. So those are some of the indicators that I might point to, but the question is right that as export revenues may decline over the long term, there's going to be less fiscal space for exporting countries to deal with the transition. And I think that's got to be managed quite carefully. For exporting countries, I think the clear lesson is accelerate renewables now so you can maximize your export revenues into the future.
Thank you very much, Sam. Kate, one thing that we also haven't talked a lot about is hydropower. And for China, we've seen that also as a part of its mix. Nepal has hydropower potential. But how do you see that as a source of energy as these countries look to diversify, but also given the geopolitical issue around China's dam building and hydropower storage capacity building, needing into transboundary river sharing? How do you see that shaping up as a part of Asia's energy strategy?
Sorry, cut it up for a minute, but is that aimed at me?
Yes, Kate, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, so hydropower is a complex issue. In China, obviously, it's been a huge source of, fossil-free baseload. But in recent years, the irony is that climate change is impacting water flows, in addition to just, issues around project planning in the first place. And that's actually been a huge cause of some of the recent issues around coal spikes and coal shortages in regions, especially in the south and southwest of China. And this is something where it's becoming less reliable from that perspective. So, that's certainly something to pay attention to in terms of whether hydro can be a reliable source in the future, especially as the climate continues to change versus some of these other renewable sources that might be intermittent, but that can be paired with storage, as I think one of the questions asked, in ways that are much more sustainable and flexible than hydropower. The geopolitics around hydro, I know this is an issue that you're a deep expert in, Farwa, so I might turn back to you on that one. But I would also note that, it will be interesting to watch as China moves forward with the Yarlung-Tsampo massive hydropower project in Western China. And again, real questions around whether this is something that can be sustainable in the long term, obviously massive impacts both on local communities and from a transboundary perspective. So, ideally, more flexible, clean power can be a solution, but still something that is part of the broader picture.
And thank you, Kate. And the way I look at it, especially for South Asia, and I think it applies also to Southeast Asia, the water stress is an important one to watch because it's not only pertinent to the future of hydropower and the geopolitics of the region, given the transboundary river sharing or the lack of it amid the political tensions coming in the way of cooperation, but also if you look at solar power integration, water is a huge requirement, and there's a lot of pressure on water tables because of solar implementation in a bunch of these countries, but also for critical minerals and mining and processing, all of those are going to be water intensive processes. So when you're looking at that transition and developing your portfolio towards clean energy, water and availability and sustainable access is going to be an important factor to recognize in policymaking and all the reforms and conversations that are going to be important from a decision-making perspective as to what will happen next. But one more question, which is regarding how have other energy and cooling sources like helium-3 been impacted during the conflict, and what is the impact on Asia? Now, I'll keep this open to anyone who would like to respond to this. Maybe Atul, if you want to quickly respond to this.
The question is about helium
Yes.
availability. Yeah, I mean, all of these, helium, sulfur, hydrogen, these are all globally traded commodity, and there is some concentration for these in the Middle East, or it's a large source of supply, but it's not a crisis situation. There are alternatives, and you can switch your refining system, for example, to produce. As an example, you would take India actually um, moved away. When it had an LPG shortage, they just tuned this refining system and produced more LPG at the beginning of the crisis. So some of these are important, but they are not critical. I mean, the biggest issue is oil. You really you cannot produce oil. You cannot develop new resources as quickly as you can do for other things.
I would just
Thank
add
you,
on helium quickly.
Yeah.
Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, SK Hynix, Samsung, they've all said that they have sufficient storage of helium. Their helium recycling facilities in place, and so it's certainly less of a crisis, although a large share of helium does come from the Middle East. Yeah.
I think it's just that alarm bells have been ringing across sectors to know what's next, and do we have enough? And there are questions about capacities and capabilities in every what way, and acknowledging what is happening to oil. But of course, a large part of it is what's happening in the United States and what the United States will do next, which will determine the next steps in this energy landscape as well. So, okay, there's a question on the Trump administration and who's advising the admin on energy.
Yeah, so in terms of the US impact on the region, I'd go back to Liberation Day, long before the crisis started, and just think about the impact that had on many Asian nations' economies. So these countries were already suffering as a result of the tensions that US had brought about from an economic perspective. And in many of the bilateral conversations, the US admin was trying to get these countries to buy more long-term contracts for US oil and gas. But I think, many of these countries, they don't want to choose between the US and China. But if you look at the difference between, volatility from a geopolitical perspective, and, like going into a partnership with a country like the US that has been geopolitically volatile, versus taking advantage of low cost, clean technologies that could provide energy security, I think sort of the pathway forward for many of these countries is quite evident. And I think going forward, just keeping an eye on, especially I think these countries want stability between the US and China, but they don't want to have to choose, but they want security most of all, both economically and from an energy perspective. So whatever is going to provide that, I think will be what they want to choose. And of course, if the US wants to lean into oil and gas deals, but not be able to provide that security over the long term, that'll be a difficult pathway for the US.
And thank you, Kate. And I think there's another question about U.S. leadership and in some of the larger climate conversations and how it has been in the past year. And when we go into the G7 this month and then G20 later this year, how much focus there will be on. I'm sure there'll be a lot of focus on economic security. We have seen that coming out of the United States, but how much would it be in a way that would work well for the allies and the partners, in that they see it as a mutually beneficial cooperation with win-win on both sides, acknowledging the damage that's been done. But we have reached the top of our hour. Thank you very much to our panelists for joining us for this very important, timely, and insightful discussion. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone who's tuned in has too. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Thank you for making this conversation all the more engaging through your questions. Please stay in touch with the Asia Society Policy Institute at the Asia Society. Subscribe to our newsletters and keep watching the space for more.